Hello, I'm Casey Aiken, and this is 21 This Week. Coming up next, why did Councilmember Kristin Mink compare Muslim parents to white supremacists? In a new poll, 60% of Marylanders oppose electric vehicle mandate. The Maryland NAACP confronts the state over dreadful Black student learning outcomes and the Greek tragedy that is Donald Trump. Our panel of insiders will give you the story behind the story. We're joined by the Secretary of the Maryland Republican Central Committee, Mark Uncapher, and former County Council member and CEO of SkillSmart, Mike Knapp. Stay tuned for these stories and more on the next 21 This Week. In response to a group of concerned Montgomery County parents, outraged that the school board will not allow them to opt out of LGBT gender ideology being pushed on their kids in elementary schools, Councilmember Kristin Mink equated members of Family Rights for Religious Freedom, a group which also includes Christian and Muslim members, as white supremacists. Mark, Councilmember Mink stated that some Muslim families are on the same side of an issue as white supremacists and outright bigots. How is it that we've evolved to a point where parents who disagree with a school board decision are being viciously attacked by our elected representatives on the county council?
Well, I think the challenge here is that the diversity means diversity of identity and doesn't mean diversity of opinion. As a result, there's an intolerance of a variety of opinions which clearly exist when it frankly diverges from what people like Councilwoman Mink believe. And I got to say, she is in fact a serial offender of this. Of course, she ended up having to apologize for her comments about Zionist Jews, which is a great example of where the intersection of both identity and opinion come together.
Well, I'm just, flabbergasted that, in the last 20 years, the intolerance that we have for one another seems to continually be on the rise. So it's just surprising. Mike, 2 years ago, there was a political uprising by parents in the state of Virginia who were also frustrated that their parental rights were being ignored by the school system. That incident contributed to the election of Republican Glen Youngkin as governor. We've been kind of waiting for this to occur in Montgomery County, but are we now on the precipice of such a revolt here in our own county?
I don't think we are. I think that you and Mark both recognize the issues, and I think it's one of intolerance. I think we've created a situation in communities where we used to be focused on how do we actually bring people together and how do we address and make our school system stronger. And unfortunately, we've got lots of folks who are trying to find very divisive issues on all sides of ideology, unfortunately. And we end up focusing a lot of time on more, I don't say they're fringe issues, but they're issues where we can provide a wedge and we can drive that wedge in, and then we try and figure out whose side everybody is on and get people to comment on it. And I just think it's a very unfortunate scenario, but we've seen this evolve over the last 6 to 8 years, and it's not just our schools, it takes place all over the place. And we've got to figure out ways to not just, as we saw, I think, in Northern Virginia, the current governor saw this as a political opportunity, kind of saw the parade and ran and got in front of the parade. And I think what we've got to be able to do is to get back to a point where our elected officials and community leaders are, in fact, leading and bringing people back together, not kind of feeding into the divisiveness.
Well, I got to disagree with you slightly, and particularly about this topic. And I think it's important to note that the Montgomery County School Board has taken a more radical position on this subject than even the state, and saying that parents do not have the right to opt out of these teachings. And I think this is also a fundamental issue. It's that not only are we intolerant, but our leaders are intolerant of the views of the people that are their constituency. The parents, parents are the first teachers of their children, not the Montgomery County public school system.
That is true. Although I think one of the things that's important is there's, again, this notion of somehow we're teaching ideology. And the issue is these are books that are being read to talk about people in communities, people in environment, people in space. And so there's a notion that people want to say, oh, we're trying to present an ideology. And I don't agree that people are presenting an ideology. I think people want to say that story, but I think we're actually trying to create opportunities where students can see themselves and see people in their families and in their communities represented in the books that they read and the conversations they have. And people want to talk about that as trying to change people's ideology. And the reality is, I think we're trying to get to a point that we're showing what inclusivity actually looks like.
Well, Mark, I'm going to let you have the last word on this. We got to go to break
again,
soon.
and I would come back to there are a diversity of perspectives and opinions, and all too often the focus is exclusively on diversity of identity and not addressing what are differences of opinion that deserve to be aired.
Well, we're gonna have to break because we have some other very important topics to discuss today. One of them is that one of the first things that Maryland Governor Wes Moore committed the state to upon assuming office was an aggressive goal of involving the sale of, you got it, electric vehicles. Now, a recent opinion poll found that, get this, 60%, that's 60, that's a big majority of Marylanders oppose the plan to mandate electrical vehicle sales by 2035. And that means no new gas engine cars can be sold after 2035. Mike, shockingly, this is the even bigger story. 54% of the opponents stated they opposed the decision if it meant going against the holy grail of environmentalism and reduced carbon dioxide emissions. Are you surprised by the result?
Not really. I mean, I think this is still a fundamental sea change for many people. And I mean, I think it becomes an element of practicality. I think there are lofty goals and there are aspirations that we hope to achieve. But I think at the end of the day, there's still a lot of people who are trying to figure out, I got to drive a car to get from point A to point B. And we've got a lot of folks who have to drive a long way. And I'm not convinced yet or understand the technology well enough yet to know if I get someplace, can I actually get back? And I think it's that simple. Show me that the technology is there and show me that this works. And I think people are still trying to get accustomed to that. And I'm not surprised at all. I think it's a real fundamental sea change for many people.
Well, here, of course, I'm the contrarian here. I mean, I am appalled that the state of Maryland sacrificed its sovereignty to the state of California on this issue, and that we alone are just going to go meekly following California into the Pacific Ocean. This is nuts. Mark, many believed, and I think Mike touched on this, that there are insufficient sources to supply electricity if such a mandate is enforced.
Well, that's true. I think what we're seeing is sticker shock. And I'm not, you referenced the 60% number. It's going to go up when people have to take into account the costs associated, the difference between, an electric vehicle and a gas-powered vehicle and the cost of electricity and the inconvenience of charging. We need to have a more forthright conversation about what are the most effective ways of dealing economically, effective ways of dealing with climate change. Too often the conversation has been framed of everybody on the one side is a denier, and on the other side you have to adopt whatever the brainstorm they've come up with latest in California. And there is a middle ground that reflects the fact of what's the most effective way of making that transition. How do we take into account the fact that China is not doing anything, and what we do in Maryland is being dwarfed by what's being done in a single city in China? Well,
here's the exit question. Put yourself in Philadelphia in the 1789. Can you imagine Adams, Jefferson, Franklin saying what color horse you have to ride, that you can only ride quarter horses, not thoroughbreds? I mean, my goodness, this is insanity what our legislators are doing.
Well, but the other thing that's really interesting is where the market itself is going. I continue to be amazed at how the auto industry is transitioning. And I'm very curious to see if we go back 15 years and see where we were with electric vehicles at that point, where we are today and where the markets are going. part of it is as a policy piece, part of it are the markets themselves. And I think we're going to be in a very interesting place over the next 5 to 7 years. And I'm curious to see what it is. I don't know how it'll play out, but I think markets will help drive this too.
Well, here's the last word on this, and I'm going to take it. Toyota, the largest manufacturer of vehicles in the world, is not going all in on electric because hybrid vehicles produce better emission results than do electric vehicles. Stay tuned when we come back from this short break. The Greek tragedy, that is Donald Trump, and the NAACP confronts the state over dreadful Black student learning outcomes. Stay tuned. And welcome back. After the Baltimore City school system revealed that 0 students were proficient in math across the 23 schools in their system, the NAACP announced that it would hold a conference with state and local officials to address the dreadful Black student outcomes, calling the results intolerable. Mark, in its press release, the NAACP cited lagging academic achievement, students graduating without necessary proficiency, breakdown in school discipline, and a school-to-prison pipeline, and called it unacceptable. Now, the Baltimore school system is not the only major urban system with these problems, but these problems have been apparent in Baltimore for the past 50 years. How can it be reversed?
Well, this is a huge challenge. We've been through. We're obviously going through the blueprint now. We went through Thornton roughly 20 years ago. I think it's not just putting more financial resources. I think we need a kind of fundamental change in the way the systems are. We've talked about school choice. Certainly in DC now, half the kids go to charter schools. What we have is a system that's broken, and we need to do more than simply use the existing system with more money.
So, Mike, a report from the Center for Reinventing Public Education said this: America is at a profound moment of social struggle. School improvement can't wait for us to solve poverty or racial injustice. Critics say that legislators are not serious about fixing this program until they accept school choice and charter schools and voucher programs.
Well, I mean, I think the challenge, well, a lot of challenges there. You can't fix poverty or racial injustice and have that be resolved before we fix the school systems. The reality is, though, that we also need to understand, acknowledge, and recognize that we have so many students that are coming from backgrounds where they're seeing all of those elements, and that has to be taken into account. And I think that's one of the significant challenges that we see is we don't yet have a way to address that in our school systems, and we don't know how to do that well. And so as a result, we're still trying to take models that worked 20 years ago in suburban communities and try to apply them to increasingly diverse, increasingly poor, and assuming that somehow that's going to work. And we've got to come up with a way to figure out how to meet those students where they are, provide the resources they need. And I agree with you, Mark, it's not just about putting more money in. If you look at what happened in Montgomery County in this last budgeting cycle, we increased education by a lot. I can't tell you what we're going to spend the money on. There was no clarity as to where that was going to go. I mean, we talked about grand, broad brush strokes of things, but we need to be boots on the ground. We're going to make these changes to get these specific outcomes and be very clear on what we're tracking, what we're measuring, and to be able to determine whether or not students are being more successful. And we don't have those plans in place today that I can tell. And I think we've got to start really getting much clearer and identifying what those challenges are and what our solutions are for those challenges, and reappropriating how our dollars are spent to meet those specific needs.
Well, the one quote I didn't read from the NAACP was that Black children can learn just as well as any other children.
Of course.
And so, which means, and I think this goes back to your point, Mike, we got to have expectations, and maybe we need to have higher expectations of what our children are capable of doing and what their outcomes should be. Yeah. Mark, I'll let you comment.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, we've talked about in the past, one of the things about Montgomery County schools is the expectation that with homework and parent involvement and tutoring and supplemental, the parents take a very active role, are expected to take a very active role in education. And I think we got to step back from that and put more responsibility on the schools to provide that full range of support without the expectation that the parents are always going to be there to backstop the schools when they aren't able to educate effectively.
Also, Mike, are the schools capable of doing that though?
Sure, they have to be. We have to figure out how to get there. Otherwise we're failing our children. And so it's not as are they capable or are they not capable? That's the challenge that we have to address, and we have to address it. So we have to come up with ways to accommodate and understand that we have increasingly diverse populations, that we have two parents that are working 1 and 2 and 3 jobs. And so it's not a suburban model or even an urban model that takes into account parents, to your point, who are going to engage and be able to kind of rely on that backstop. We've got to be able to provide those students the tools and the resources that they need, and we just have to figure it out.
Well, I'll have the last word. We need to break the cycle of being dependent on the teachers union. We need to go to school vouchers so that every parent can choose the school they want to send their children to. We need competition in education.
We need to create a way to scale that too. We've got 170,000 students in Montgomery County. And if ever all of a sudden you say, here, everybody go someplace, we don't have a system and infrastructure in a large community to be able to address that. And so that's a nice thought, but you still got to figure out a way to scale it.
Let me tell you, Mike, if this is the capitalistic system. You give people a voucher that they can take to any school that they want. There will be opportunity. There will be educators coming out of the woodwork to provide that opportunity. You know, we got to talk about, once again, the modern Greek tragedy known as the rise and fall of Donald Trump. And it's been broadcast for all to see. The former 45th president of the United States of America was charged last week, actually I guess it was Tuesday, in an indictment on 37 counts for mishandling classified information and withholding them from a grand jury. Mike, supporters of the former president claim that this is an unprecedented and corrupt indictment of Trump and a brazen election interference, as he is the likely Republican nominee. And in addition, it is just another of President Biden's further transforming the FBI and the Justice Department into political enforcers. But can there be two truths at the same time? Can Trump be the target of politically motivated investigation, but also guilty of mishandling government secret documents?
Well, I suppose that could be a reality. Clearly the mishandling of documents took place. We've got information there. He's been indicted on that. We'll let the court bear that out to see, to actually prove that to be true or not. The political piece, the challenge I always struggle with here is he makes the political element before anybody else even gets there. So he makes it political before any charges are even put out, and so I think that it's really hard because and I give him credit for this, and I struggle to give him credit for anything. He is great at spin. He is great at trying to figure out how to frame things in such a way so that he's already politicized it and trying to put that story out there in a way that's got everybody on their haunches before they ever figure out how to respond. And so I give him credit for that. And at some point, the rest of us have got to figure out how to get as good at that as he is. Otherwise, he continues to, as you say, be the Greek tragedy that keeps showing up because he gets there before people and he's more brazen than anyone else isn't getting there.
Well, unfortunately, there's a life cycle in the Greek tragedy, and I'll get to that in a second. But Mark, several of the charges that Trump is facing are related to efforts to hide the documents in his possession and keep them away from federal investigators. Now, before I wrote this script, it was announced that Trump rejected the advice of attorneys to negotiate a settlement with the Department of Justice, and he still withheld the documents. There's something wrong here.
Well, I think there's a cliche that deserves to be repeated here, which is it's not the crime that gets you, it's the cover-up. And this is a classic example of the charges that he has for obstruction of justice, for lying to investigators, for not responding. Those are independent of the underlying, withholding of the documents, which are serious in and of themselves. But you don't have to get him on that to get him on the obstruction of justice. in across the board in scores of white collar crimes, that's been the sort of the underlying criminal act that has landed people in jail. And so it's foolhardy. And when you have had legal advice through the entire process, sometimes that's the reason people may talk to investigators and get themselves in trouble. But he had legal advice for the entire process, and he chose to ignore it. It's just incredible.
I mean, look, I'm thunderstruck by this, because all he had to do was hand over the documents and to avoid criminal charges. He didn't have to do anything other than hand him over and get him back. He could get him back. My goodness, the Presidential Records Act would allow him to get them back.
And that is actually the incredible thing, which is that these documents frequently rest with the library or the office of the former president. But that said, it's under the auspices or custody of the federal government. And that wasn't done in this case. But A and B, he lied about, misrepresented what was going on to investigators.
Mike.
No, I think the part that continues to stun me is how quickly the wagons were drawn, right? So the circle was drawn in, and so that all of a sudden we've got, if you've got to already announce that you're going to pardon him if you're running as one of the Republican nominees. So that becomes a thing, which is ridiculous. That you've got people saying that, well, at least he obviously isn't a spy. We're not, people who are fully apprised of what the Espionage Act says and should do. It has nothing to do with necessarily whether or not you're a spy. It governs a lot more beyond that. But, so you've got people like Lindsey Graham who are basically saying, well, he's of course not a spy. Well, that's completely meaningless and irrelevant. So it's amazing to me how the wagons have been circled and people are defending this, and it's ludicrous.
Well, going back to my analogy of the Greek tragedy, in ancient Greek, in Greek drama, you had a central character who was filled with hubris and who was arrogant, and his arrogance led him to his fall and led him to nemesis, which was punishment. And I'm sure that this is the next step, and maybe it's the first step for Donald Trump, because he's been able to avoid punishment up till now. But my guess is that he can complain all he wants about Hillary this and Hillary that, and Biden this and Biden that. But at the end of the day, I think he's going to find himself in hot water and be convicted for some of these offenses.
Well, no, I think you're right. I mean, even Pence, I mean, the big distinction is they all gave them back. Once they were identified, they returned them. It was not an issue. They acknowledged, and this was a problem, and we gave it back. And that's, I guess, the line that's out there that people seem not to be able to understand.
Mark, the last word.
I was going to say, I mean, one of his political strengths since 2015 has been as a disruptor of breaking down norms and shaking things up in completely unexpected ways. There does come a point where you do a little bit too much disruption and put yourself in legal peril, and that is where he is right now.
Well, I hope for the nation it gets resolved, and it gets resolved quickly, and we're able to go on to better things. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here today. When we come back, parting shots. Welcome back, and now with parting shots, Mark Uncapher.
So one of the challenging and disturbing statistics coming out of MCPS is the amount of absenteeism. Some 25% of students are chronically absent. Some schools, it's over 50%. This is a really disturbing issue.
Thank you, Mark. Mike Knapp, your parting shot.
So as we're going into the weekend, it's Juneteenth celebration. And while it's a relatively new holiday, I continue to be impressed at how the communities have engaged and embraced and the number of events that are taking place. And so I would encourage folks to go out and take advantage of those events over the holiday weekend. And also, it's also the beginning of summertime. And so both my daughters were summer swimmers, and there were tens of thousands of kids in Montgomery County who do this. And so it's a first competitive weekend. So good luck, everybody, and have a great time.
Thank you, Mike. And I think it's a wonderful thing that the federal government has acknowledged my wedding anniversary of June 19th for everyone to have a holiday. I want to thank you all for being here today. I want to thank the audience for tuning in each and every week to Montgomery County's hardest hitting political talk show. For 21 this week, I'm Casey Aiken.